Could you just explain to us what has happened, what has gone on in Australia's Pacific diplomacy in the last couple of weeks?
Well, in a funny way, Australia's Pacific diplomacy is something of an oxymoron. We really haven't had a terribly successful couple of weeks in the exercise of diplomacy in the Pacific. And I think it's quite a reasonable thing to observe that for all of his many political and other skills, the Prime Minister is not a natural diplomat. That, consistent with many other Australian Prime Ministers, he tends to go into the Pacific thinking that we have the answers to all of the problems of the Pacific, when in fact we haven't even listened to the questions that the Pacific might ask of us. So we went into Vanuatu and to Papua New Guinea with the solution to a problem which neither of them really have. We've got the problem, but we don't articulate the problem clearly enough for Pacific countries to want to adopt our solutions. Our problem is that we want to jostle and bump into China in the Pacific. We don't know how to manage China in the Pacific. China certainly doesn't know how to manage us, because we're effectively working at cross purposes in the Pacific on premises which the Pacific countries themselves don't like and don't want. So the idea that we want to support America in a great power competition with China in the Pacific is, effectively anathema to the countries of the Pacific, because they get no benefit out of that. I'd argue that we don't get any benefit out of that either, because when you start competing with a country of 1.6 billion people, which is a rising power, both economically and strategically, you're never going to win in that competition. You might minimise your losses, but you'll never be in a position to maximise your gains. Diplomacy is about maximising gains. And the natural terms on which Australia can operate its diplomacy in the Pacific is much more through alignment with the Pacific partners than it is through contest against China. So the very way in which we're going about our diplomacy in the Pacific, I think, virtually guarantees failure. We might bludgeon them, and eventually, grudgingly, they'll accept some outcome that appears to favour Australia, but they won't have their hearts in it, and they will just build up what is already very clear in the way in which Pacific countries look at Australia. They'll build up their resentment. And so all we're doing, I think, is creating further resentment for no singular advantage to either the Pacific countries or ourselves. That is pretty poor diplomacy. And for that reason, I think a conversation between the Prime Minister and President Trump around how you actually think about Pacific diplomacy could be a very rewarding experience for both of them.
Alan, one of the, or I guess the area where there is arguably the most misalignment between Pacific and Australian interests, if we could call them that, is of course climate change. At the UN General Assembly, the Prime Minister committed Australia to some 2035 emissions targets of 62 to 70% reduction on 2005 levels, which all the science tells us is inadequate. We know that's inadequate. You've worked for a climate change minister. How do you think Australia's commitments there would be understood by Pacific nations in the context of all you've just talked about?
Look, Emma, if it weren't so serious, the Pacific nations would regard our policy as laughable. But it isn't laughable because our policy is a minimalist policy. It is the minimum. It has minimum effect and the maximum chance of being achieved as a policy, which means that it's really not going to do anything to anybody that will cut carbon emissions in a way that disadvantages those who are the biggest carbon producers and emitters. So we're not doing anything that meets the fundamental needs of the Pacific countries, three of which are subject to deep questions about their survivability. I mean, when we talk about existential threats, the clearest ones in the world at the moment are in the Pacific, in parts of Southeast Asia and in Africa, all for different reasons. It's water levels and sea levels in the Pacific. It's flooding in very many parts of Southeast Asia, and it's perpetual droughts in Africa. And these things are of critical importance, and countries such as Australia, rich, relatively small populations, much capacity to do things, lots of agency, simply are not stepping up to the task, not only about the survival of our neighbours, but indeed stepping up to the task of our own long-term survival with improvements in the quality of our survivability. It's not a zero-sum game. You know, it's not survival at lower standards. What we've got to focus on is long-term survival at improved standards. And that is the nature of successful public policy. So in the Pacific, we damage ourselves by playing the wrong geostrategic game and playing the wrong climate game. And when you've got those two things working in combination, is it any wonder that the last couple of weeks have been disappointing from the perspective of Australia's Pacific diplomacy?
Disappointing is a perhaps generous way to put it, but
one might say disastrous.
one might say that.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.